In the late 60s and early 70s, Germany saw an explosion of musical creativity, experimenting with electronics, noise, psychedelic sounds, and a sense that Germany needed a new music, its own music, a fresh cultural restart after the Second World War. Now, this was a broader artistic and cultural movement, it wasn't just music, and the musical experimentation doesn't really fit within one genre, really. But as a cultural phenomenon, during a specific era, it does all fit together. This was the free-form, heavy jamming of Amon Duül II, the driving and flowing rhythms of Neu and Can. This was the proto-industrial sounds of Faust and Kluster, the meditative soundscapes of Tangerine Dream, Harmonia, and Klaus Schulze. This is krautrock. There are a lot of stupid genre names out there, but this one really takes the cake for me. The bands in the scene hated it, even though some named their songs after it as a joke. It was a merging of a racial slur and the word rock, and depending on the band, some found being called rock even more of an insult, given how many of them were experimenting with things that were well outside of rock music. Another term for this genre is kosmische Musik, which translates to cosmic music. This would apply better to some of these bands like Tangerine Dream's spacey musical journeys. It might apply to the freeform, psychedelic sounds of Amon Duül II, but Kraftwerk is over here singing about the glorious experience of driving down the highway, and noise rhythms were highly inspired by football. So this one is also not perfect. But I can understand why we don't just want to call it post-World War II German experimental music or something like that, because it would be a bit of a mouthful. So for the same reason I still say shoegaze and grunge, even though I don't really like them, I'm gonna stick to krautrock for this video. But we're talking about avant-garde music, ambient, prog rock, and a lot of artists that were experimenting with the newly developing possibilities of synthesizers. I'm Michael, this is Eclecticism, and I apologize ahead of time for any and all mispronunciations. This channel is supported by friends of the channel over on Patreon, and this video is dedicated to Mila Mika, who's been a friend of the channel for 3 months now, so thanks Mila for helping to keep the channel going. We're gonna get into the music pretty soon, but I think the historical context is important, especially since so much time has passed. So I'm gonna start off with a really broad historical overview of what was going on in Germany around this time. If you have too short of an attention span for that, feel free to skip ahead to the Amon Duül II chapter. Good, glad to see you're sticking around for this bit. Let's have a quick and probably superficial look at Germany in the late 60s. For any of you who actually lived through this time period in Germany, I'd love to get your thoughts in the comments section about what your perception of it was like. I obviously wasn't there. This is coming from me as someone who's read books and read articles and listened to a lot of the music, but that's where my perception's coming from. Part 1. After the fall of the Third Reich, the German people were culturally adrift and traumatized. For one, traumatized by the violence of the Third Reich, and the shared culpability of all the atrocities carried out under the dictatorship of Hitler. They were culturally traumatized by Hitler as well. His regime saw new art movements as signs of dangerous free thinking, which was not allowed, obviously, so he declared any attempts at artistic innovation as degenerate art, and even set up a big exhibition of this art designed to encourage the German people to mock it. This exhibit was, ironically, massively more popular than the Great German Art Exhibition, which was a show conceived to illustrate what great art under the Third Reich was supposed to look like. Sculptures of Germanic perfection, aka a bunch of muscular naked dudes, landscape paintings of Germany, paintings of war that glorified it. Even by the first premiere there, it had been dubbed by some people as the Kitsch Palace. Movements like the Cubists, Futurists, and Dadaists were, among others, called out as spoilers of art by the regime in charge. So during the Nazi era, and in the devastation that followed it, decades went by without Germany having its own real artistic identity that hadn't been prescribed for propaganda purposes and supported by the state. One prescribed form of art was Schlager. Schlager was descended from operetta music, a style designed to not challenge listeners and to have mass appeal, and to enforce norms. I'm not an expert, but what I've heard from this time period strikes me as very sappy, docile, and painfully bland. Germany was also traumatized by the war itself, of course, and all of the violence of fighting and losing a massive war. The cities themselves still bore the physical scars of the conflict in the late 60s, with musicians from this scene talking about what it was like growing up near, or even in, buildings that had been damaged by bombs and by combat. The American occupation brought American and British culture into Germany, which filled some of Germany's own cultural void with something foreign. Now they had the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, McDonald's. Many of Germany's more popular bands in the 60s were mimicking the style of this imported music, from mercy beat to blues rock, or else you were stuck with Schlager or different kinds of folk music, maybe a little classical. The perception among the more liberal, younger generation was that the older generations were in denial about their shared culpability in so many atrocities, and happy to embrace the consumer culture that was suddenly being imported. Those involved with this youth counterculture wanted more, and this applied to music too. They wanted something of their own, not dependent on the blues music that informed so many of the imported artists. This was an era of student uprisings, anti-capitalist communes, and the desire to find a new way of living that wasn't dependent on either Germany's recent past or on imported culture. These young German musicians and artists felt the need to create something that could truly be their own. This desire had an impact across all the arts, but I'm only here to focus on the music because that's kind of my thing. The first band we'll look at was quite literally one of those communes, with the music being an expression of their communal values and their wish to challenge the status quo. Amon Duül was the name of a Munich commune, a community of young people wishing to escape the patriarchal nuclear family structure and to escape from the alt-Nazi establishment, where lots of ex-Nazis still held many positions of social power. Amon Duül was the name of this commune, and also their band name when the members of the commune made music together at various demonstrations or events. Amon Duül was mostly improvised, rhythmic, and to my ears is more of a musical curio than something I'd really call enjoyable. They had several albums worth of material that were all recorded during one session, and these albums were released over a period of years. It wasn't long before some of the more musically minded members of Amon Duül wanted to focus on improving their music and split off from the project of the commune. This new band, Amon Duül II, is where I recommend starting your krautrock journey. This was very psychedelic music, and it pushed past any limits of genre. They didn't rely on the blues in their sound for the most part, and that alone helps to set them apart. Their music was heavy, sometimes a bit folky, often as loud and in your face as anything else of the era, including Black Sabbath. While you can hear some connections with the broader psychedelic movement, Amon Duül II was definitely creating their own lane, a dark and heavy and expansive, incredibly boundary-free approach to music. This band has been active across many decades now, but they're most well known for their earliest era. Their debut, Phallus Dei, is a strong start to their body of work. Phallus Dei translates to God's Phallus, which is an amazing album name. And if you put it together with God's Balls by Seattle band Tad, you got a whole package. I'm sorry, I can't help it. The first side of Phallus Dei is a series of shorter pieces that establish a somber, mysterious, and dark mood. Then on the second side, you have the longer self-titled piece, which is a much longer jam that rolls through a variety of different musical styles and soundscapes, at times bordering on folk, or free jazz, or rock. The original track listing is, to me, much better than what you'll now find on streaming services. Originally, the long title track came at the end, after the shorter track set the mood of the album. I recommend going with the original track list if you try this one out. Amon Duül II's second album, Yeti, is commonly seen as their masterpiece, and it's hard to argue with this. Yeti is a staggering double album that takes off from where the Phallus left off. An album with an impressive scope of influences and musical styles. Yet it doesn't feel like an attempt at just showing off as musicians. It all feels as communal as the environment the band came out of, with multiple vocalists and no clear front person. One interesting aspect of this scene, actually, where a lot of the bands were specifically left-leaning and anti-fascist, is their avoidance of having what felt like a leader or front person. You'll notice this among a lot, but not all, of the bands we're going to cover. Most bands at least present an image of functioning as democracies. With Amon Duül II, there are solos and a level of virtuosity without it feeling like it's being done for its own sake, or without it focusing too much on any one member. But the commune culture wasn't without its own flaws. The only female member of Amon Duül II was Renate Noop, who sometimes performed backing vocals and on Yeti performed the lead vocals on Archangel's Thunderbird. Noop left the band not that long after, describing the culture of the band as being macho, and she struggled to have what she felt was a meaningful voice in the band, often not even having actual lyrics to perform, and just kind of adding oohs and ahs to the background of songs. She'd go on to join another band we'll discuss, Popol Vuh, where her talents were a little bit better integrated. Amon Duül II have a run of excellent albums, and for contrast with Yeti, I'd also recommend trying out Wolf City, where their song lengths and structures have moved a bit closer to what could maybe work on the radio. But even with these more focused song lengths, it's a really strong album, just without the extensive jamming that they embraced on their earlier work. Their entire run, from Phallus Day through Wolf City, are krautrock classics to me. Yeti is the one that I picked for my top 10 on krautrock, which came out recently. For entry points to their music, I really recommend Yeti and Wolf City, but like I said, you really can't go wrong with most of their early work. While the Commune kids were creating a cacophony, Cologne's krautrock contribution kicked off with a quartet called Can. The members of Can were a bit older than a lot of these other bands, already in their 30s, with a lot of musical knowledge between them. The idea that inspired the band to form was bringing together musicians from very different disciplines who are all highly skilled in those original styles, and seeing what new form of music that this group of musicians would make when they were brought together. Ermin Schmidt was a student of classical piano. Yaki Liebezeit was a knowledgeable jazz drummer who had experimented with traditional jazz styles and also with more contemporary things like free jazz. Holger Czukay has some background in classical and some in jazz. He'd been a student of the controversial electronic composer Karl Stockhausen for some time, with the goal of becoming a composer himself, and only ended these studies when he decided it was time to form Can. And Mikael Karoli was a multi-instrumentalist who had an interest in many experimental bands, but had been studying law when this band came together. Obviously, the law career got put on the back burner. A key element of Can was the groove, laid down initially by drummer Liebezeit. At one point after a show, someone came up to Liebezeit and told him, "You must play monotonously." Whether this was divine intervention or just someone stoned out of their gourd, we'll never know. But the phrase resonated, and you can clearly pick up the unique but also minimal grooves that flow through Can compositions. One thing that I love about Can is how their songs sound so groovy and have the feeling of a band being recorded live. Yet they were actually highly constructed in the studio, with snippets of recordings being flipped around and moved around, cut in from other takes. A lot of this was done manually by Holger. Because of Yaki's incredibly steady, monotonous beats, they could do this and still have the groove preserved throughout the track, so it made it really easy to experiment in the studio. Ironically, Yaki, who had laid down these beats, was the person least interested in chopping up things and playing around with them. He was most interested in the synergy of actually playing as a group, and his main influence during this editing process was making sure they didn't lose that groove in their excitement to experiment. Early on, Ken had a vocalist named Malcolm Mooney, an American who was a friend of Ermin and Holger. He was a painter involved in the art scene, and he was invited to a Can rehearsal one night, where he spontaneously just began performing stream of consciousness vocals over what the band was playing. The band loved his contribution, and suddenly, Can had a vocalist. Although he's not the most well-known of Can's vocalists, I really love his work with the band. His vocals are sharp and almost a second layer of percussion, adding to the groove of the song and making it feel more intricate. The lyrics often feel abstract, the meaning almost never matters, which makes it easy to focus more on the sound of the vocals than the meaning of the words. They recorded an album, Prepared to Meet Thy Noom, but it was rejected by so many labels they abandoned it and moved on to recording a second debut album. Some of those first recordings were later released as Delay 1968. And even though this wasn't released for years and years, I think this is an essential Can release. It is so good and shows their ability to ride a groove so steadily and with so much energy that it starts to feel trance-like. Just listen to the absolute banger Uphill. Their actual debut album was Monster Movie, and this is also essential if you enjoy the Malcolm Mooney era of the band. For me, songs like You Do Right and Father Cannot Yell were early signs of just how great Can was. These were the only two albums recorded with Mooney. He was struggling with mental health issues during this time with Can, and this was illustrated by one night when he was chanting manically throughout the song Uphill and got stuck just repeating upstairs, downstairs over and over again for 3 hours. Most of this after the rest of the band had stopped playing completely. On his psychiatrist's advice, he left Can to go focus on his mental health. Can's second vocalist was the iconic Damo Suzuki. A Japanese expatriate, he was at a park, apparently screaming and or praying, depending on the version of the story, maybe both. From where they were having coffee at a nearby cafe, Holger Czukay said, "That's going to be our new singer." They went and spoke to Damo and invited him to sing at their sold-out show that night, without any practice. Suzuki was free, so he said sure. Although he started that first show a bit timid and unsure, as it went on he began shouting and getting caught up in the music. It was apparently such an assault that most of the concert hall just cleared out, with like a few people left. The band loved it. Damo Suzuki was quickly accepted as their new singer. For many, the Suzuki era is the peak of Can, and it would include Tago Mago, Ege Bamyasa, Soundtracks, and Future Days. I don't disagree that all of these are peak Can albums. I'd extend their run of vital albums to both of those Mooney releases we talked about, and that it also includes Soon Over Babaluma after both of these singers were gone from the band. If you're brand new to Can, Tago Mago is often seen as their classic among the classics. I think Ege Bamyasa is a slightly smoother transition into Can unless you already love a lot of avant-garde stuff. Future Days is another incredibly good and maybe a less challenging entry point as well, with less noise and more melody, even sometimes feeling ambient. Ege Bamyasa and Tago Mago make for a good starting point, but I'd recommend exploring more than just those two, because Can was really a monumental band, and massively influential on later artists, including Talk Talk, Sonic Youth, Radiohead, and Spoon, who named themselves after a Can song, among many others. While these first bands could more or less be considered rock music, something entirely different was happening over in Berlin. In 1970, a trio by the name of Kluster, with a K, released a highly experimental album of noise with spoken word performed over it. This trio was Conrad Schnitzler, Dieter Mobius, and Hans-Joachim Brodelius. This experimental electronic work had a lot in common with the industrial movement, which would come along later in the 70s. Funnily enough, the spoken word element of this album wasn't an idea of the band at all. It was a contractual obligation they had to put up with to get their weird shit put out. Their first two albums were sponsored by a church that had an interest in new German music, but the church insisted on adding political and religious spoken word to the first side of each album. The band didn't like it, but they tolerated it. Schnitzler later said that the spoken word elements were fine as long as you don't actually speak German. Kluster would last for a few years, and for 3 albums, before Schnitzler would leave the band to focus on his own solo works, continuing to experiment with noise in a prolific career that would go all the way to the present. I'm definitely not an expert on his whole career, but I have thoughts on the ones that I've heard. His debut album, Root or Red, is a really good example of earlier electronic noise experiments. It opens with the sidelong track Meditation, and I have to say this is not at all something I'd put on if I were trying to meditate. It's interesting in a similar vein to Kluster with a K, but it isn't quite as far out in left field. You can see him beginning to mesh these sounds in a way that creates a mood. By the later 70s, he made some other great projects, including Con, that felt highly evocative and futuristic. This feels to me like it could soundtrack some edgy cyberpunk film. For a lot of its runtime, it still feels more like you're listening to sound experiments rather than, like, songs. So depending on your taste, this might be a turnoff. But I've been finding myself more and more fascinated by avant-garde and sound collage artists, so I really enjoy this one, and I definitely need to explore more of his career. The other 2 members, Brodelius and Mobius, would continue as Kluster, now with a C. Their debut as a duo is another krautrock classic to me. It's somewhere between the very harsh trio releases of Kluster with a K and the music they go on to make later in their career. This shows the band making a very unique release while in a transitional period. Kluster would go on to make a string of exceptional albums throughout the 70s. The first 2 are harsh yet beautiful in their own ways, and the later albums move further and further in a gentle, beautiful and ambient direction. Before reaching this point though, they made their 3rd album, Zuckerzeit, translates to Sugar Time. It shows them in a sweet spot, between the noise of the earlier albums and the later serenity they'd find, where everything feels less harsh, yet still highly innovative and experimental. I'd really recommend Zuckerzeit for the most essential of the Kluster albums, in my eyes, although everything they recorded in the 70s is to me very, very good. For exploring their gentler later period, So So is a really good starting point, and they also made a really good album with Brian Eno. A scene focused around electronic experimental music. The Berlin School often gets lumped in with krautrock because it was happening in Germany during the same era. Musically, it has a distinct identity and sometimes feels a bit more like an actual scene music-wise. Generally speaking, the artists in the Berlin School seemed less political, and this is also reflected in more solo artists and bands with clear leaders in this scene. For example, Edgar Froese, the only permanent member of the unbelievably prolific Tangerine Dream. With a number of albums that is now in the 3 digits, This can be an intimidating band to start exploring, but they're absolutely essential if you're exploring early electronic music. Again, their first release was the most harsh and experimental, and their music would become more harmonious and focus more on ambient music as time went on. Electronic Meditation was a trio recording, and retrospectively is a supergroup. You have Edgar Froese, Conrad Schnitzler before his time in Kluster, with a K, and then Klaus Schulze. There was some butting of heads between these three, with both Schnitzler and Schulze wanting more creative freedom than Froese was wanting to give them. So this was the only Tangerine Dream album with this lineup, and it sounds very much like a different band. Their second album, Alpha Centauri, is a great place to start with Tangerine Dream, capturing the cosmic ambient electronic sounds that they would explore and refine over the years. I really recommend their first 7 albums, basically everything up to Stratosphere. But again, to give you a more focused starting place, I think Zeit and Phaedra are their highest peak albums and also both different from each other. Zeit is a monolith of dark ambient music. It feels deceptively simple and nebulous, but also very unsettling. There are 4 sidelong tracks. It feels like drifting through a void, somehow both gentle and disturbing. The album expertly combines instrumentation with electronics, containing both cello arrangements and a Moog synthesizer. Then, Phaedra is a less dark, but equally beautiful exploration of electronic soundscapes. This was a breakthrough album for them, and marked a turning point in their careers. It was an album with a difficult recording process, as the modular Moog synthesizer they were using here required several hours of tuning every day to produce the sound they wanted. And then, temperature fluctuations would cause it to detune as they played. They also had multiple equipment breakdowns, including their speakers being damaged by the low bass sounds of the Moog. In the end, the breakthrough was when Froese and his wife Monique were essentially experimenting in the studio. Froese playing a double keyboarded mellotron, and his wife turning a variety of knobs to phase the sounds. This little breakthrough session is on the album with the title Mysterious Semblance at the Strand of Nightmares, and it was what really kicked off the approach they took for the rest of the album. You can hear how quickly temperature would impact the sounds they were producing. On the longer title track, some of the changes in the sound towards the end were because of the oscillators heating up and detuning while they were recording it, and this adds to the cosmic strangeness of this absolutely iconic piece. After Phaedra's release, they would increasingly find commercial success and opportunities to do lucrative soundtrack work, becoming one of the most commercially viable bands from this whole scene. The follow-up album to Phaedra, Rubicon, is a very strong follow-up, and it's also one of my favorites. This is another one that's less dark and less heavy feeling than those earlier works. Don't let their soundtrack work or their immense discography put you off. Tangerine Dream have had a tremendous influence on all of electronic music, from the more obviously connected genres like trance or progressive electronic to musicians working in progressive metal. Steve Wilson of Porcupine Tree has called Zeit his favorite album, and Tangerine Dream recently collaborated with the death metal band Blood Incantation on Absolute Elsewhere. This was one of my favorite albums of 2024, and part of it was the way that they merged death metal with ambient soundscapes in a way that really made them feel integrated and flow back and forth between one to the other. It really illustrates that with enough talent and vision, you can create music that moves between pretty much any genres out there. By the way, just a really quick aside, there will be an episode of the Eclectic Radio Hour, a show that I do over on Mixcloud that covers some of my favorite songs from the krautrock scene. I'll be doing probably a couple of episodes on krautrock actually, but one of them will be Patreon exclusive, so if you're not signed up on Patreon, you might want to check that out. Over there you get versions of all of the videos that have music included in them. YouTube doesn't let me do that, but I can do that over on Patreon. So anyway, if you would like to hear me talk about some of this music with the actual music included, keep an eye out for the Eclectic Radio Hour. On that first album, I mentioned Klaus Schulze. He's also a name you'll want to remember. Schulze would go on to create his own influential electronic works after departing from Tangerine Dream. I love his debut, Irrlicht, which is a beauty of dark ambient music. This one feels less gentle than the sounds of Zeit, with what sounds like drones of feedback during some sections of these long songs, even though I think they were probably synths. Instead of floating through a mostly empty yet sinister outer space, this one feels like you're floating through an unsettling fog with some potentially toxic debris drifting through the air. Then he followed it up with Cyborg, which is equally beautiful, This double album has a colder tone and is also a key early space ambient recording. These two albums show Schulze in the first phase of his solo career, and he would continue to grow as an artist over the years. In the mid-70s, he released Time Wind, or maybe Time Wind, and Moon Dawn, two more seminal electronic works. These two, depending on your tastes, might be more accessible. You still have very long tracks, but a bit more happens in them, and the sounds evolve more steadily, I feel like. The Berlin School as a whole, from Tangerine Dream to Schulze, alongside other artists like Harold Groskop, Michael Hunig, and Peter Bowman, made Berlin a hotbed for electronic experimentation at a time when synths and electronic effects were still rare in music, and much more expensive and difficult to achieve than they've become in the decades since. And that leads us to our final artist of this episode, one of the first two people in Germany to own a Moog synthesizer, Florian Fricker and his band Popol Vuh. Fricker was from a bourgeois background, as you may have guessed since he ended up with a very early Moog. He studied conducting, piano, and composition in conservatories early on in his life. He was also interested in free jazz, and there were some excellent free jazz artists in Germany at this time as well. Popol Vuh began in 1969, with their earliest work featuring Fricker on the Moog. Sorry, bad habit. Alongside percussion work, tablas, and sound design provided by other members of the band. Their experimentations with the Moog can be heard on their first two albums, which are quite a bit different from the rest of their career. Then with their third album, Hosiana Mantra, they ditched the Moog for good. Fricker felt he could create a more spiritual and transcendental music by going back to traditional instruments. The stunning vocals of Yoon Young help to create this deeply spiritual mood, like you've wandered into the most life-affirming religious mass to ever take place. Yet it doesn't come off as cheap or new agey, because there's a balance in the sound, both darkness and light, moments of awe and moments that feel skeptical or questioning, a little less sure. Fricker was deeply inspired by religion, spirituality, and spiritual seeking. The title of the album is a merging of words from Eastern and Western religious traditions, and even the band name, Popol Vuh, was taken from a spiritual text he'd been enamored by. His was a very free spirituality without prescribing to a specific religion. In later interviews, he distanced himself from organized religion, saying it didn't allow the kind of free thinking that he was all about. Popol Vuh followed Hosiana Mantra with some more beautiful albums, which feel spiritual and pastoral at times, and often experimental in how they reference non-Western traditional musical styles. They also worked regularly on soundtracks for the films of Werner Herzog. I have never been able to say that name. Werner Herzog. Their works up through the Nosferatu soundtrack are all great in my opinion, but I start to have diminishing returns around about that point. Popol Vuh is an intriguing band, not quite like anything else from Germany at the time, or really anywhere else. In a time and place where so much was happening, from electronic experimentation to new approaches to rock music, and some of the earliest ambient music, Popol Vuh were outsiders among the outsiders, and definitely a group you should explore. So we're going to leave off part 1 there. Next time though, we'll look at the band that created a new, innovative German beat, we'll talk about the drug-fueled free-for-alls of the Cosmic Jokers, and we'll talk about one of the most influential bands of ever. A band that would inspire countless electronic, hip-hop, and techno artists to come. We'll also look at how the sounds of krautrock influenced a few icons of rock music, and led to some high points in the careers of Brian Eno, Iggy Pop, and David Bowie. A lot of research does go into these videos, and I'm trying my best, but I do make mistakes. Thankfully, the good people of YouTube often politely and respectfully point them out to me. Anyway, if I need to make any corrections, you'll find them down there in the description for the video. You'll also find a link to the playlist, you'll find a link to the KRAUTROCK episode of Eclectic Radio Hour. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the conclusion of this series on krautrock. I'm Michael, this is Eclecticism, and I'll see you next time.